The magnificent Cathedral of Divine Abundance was in full swing that Sunday morning. Jubilant worshippers were filled with Lagos anointing when the unexpected happened. Man-made poverty had given rise to blind devotion in one Nigeria. Hence, apostleship became a lucrative occupation in the job opportunities of the country. People hanged on to religion as their only hope when everything else has failed them. Music instruments ranged. The choir's voices soared, filling the enormous hall of the cathedral with heavenly melody. Thousands of worshippers swayed with their arms lifted, their voices echoing in reverent unison. Pastor Solomon, dressed in his signature white suit and gleaming gold tie, stood at the altar, his hands raised toward the heavens. "The Lord has spoken," his booming voice echoed through the loudspeakers. "Today is your day of divine abundance." But just as the congregation were accepting the prophetic pronouncement, Satan, who has invited his household over to the country, bagged into the church uninvited. The loud bang startled the congregation. Heads turned and whispers rippled through the crowd. At first, they thought it might be an unannounced entrance of dignitaries, as Pastor Solomon often boasted of his connections to high-ranking officials and to the real owners of the country. But what entered wasn't a convoy of politicians or special guests. It was a squad of armed men in black uniforms, their face mean and their boots pounding against the marble floor with rhythmic precision. "If you move, I move you," the lead officer yelled. A tall, stern-faced man with piercing eyes. He must have been sent from outside of Lagos, because Pastor Solomon controls almost all the uniformed men in Lagos with the power of his wealth. A gasp swept through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children. Men instinctively moved to shield their wives. Pastor Solomon froze for a split second before his confident smile returned. "This is the house of God," he declared, pointing an accusing finger at the intruders. "How dare you bring weapons into the Holy of Holies?" "Since men of gods have decided to bring gangsterism into the Holy of Holies," the officer replied, "weapons have decided to join them uninvited. We are agents of the Drug Enforcement Agency. We are here on official business." Gasps turned to shocked whispers. Pastor Solomon tilted his head, his expression turning from righteous anger to mock pity. "Official business?" he repeated, his tone laced with sarcasm. "In the house of the Lord? You must be misguided, officer. Perhaps you should sit down and join the service. Maybe God will speak to your hardened heart." The agent's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "We have reasons to believe that this ministry is the opposite of what it seemed to be, a house of devil." The congregation erupted in outrage. "Blasphemy!" shouted an elderly woman near the front. "This is persecution of God's anointed," others echoed. The uproar grew louder as some worshippers began standing, gesturing angrily at the officers. Pastor Solomon seized the moment, his voice rising. "My children, fear not. The devil will not prevail." The officer equally raised his hand, signaling his squad to hold their position. He stepped closer to the pulpit, unfazed by the pastor's theatrics. "Bring that man in," he commanded firmly. A murmur swept through the church as the side doors opened. Two officers entered, dragging a man in handcuffs. His face was pale and sweaty, his shirt crumpled as though he'd been in a scuffle. The congregation's pants turned into stunned silence. The man in handcuffs buckled as he was pushed forward. He raised his head and his eyes darted around the room before settling on Pastor Solomon. Recognition flashed across the faces of several church staff and some other church members. It was Dealey, one of Pastor Solomon's trusted logistics aides. Pastor Solomon's smile faltered. His eyes locked on Dale, and for the first time, uncertainty flashed across his face. What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice rising in pitch. "Why is my staff member in chains?" The lead agent stepped forward. "Dell was intercepted this morning at the Lagos airport with 12 kilograms of cocaine. He claims he was acting under your orders." The church building fell deathly silent. For a moment, it seemed like the air had been sucked out of the building. The once jubilant worshippers, still clutching their Bibles and hymnals, stared in shock, their mouths agape. Ardent devotees of Pastor Solomon screamed in disbelief. Some cried openly, while others shouted angrily at the officers. Pastor Solomon took a step back, his expression hardening. "Lies!" he thundered, his voice shaking the hall with every boldness. This is a plot. They have paid Dell to tarnish my name. But majority of the congregation wasn't as convinced anymore. The shock on their faces betrayed the cracks forming in their unwavering trust. People began whispering to one another, their voices growing louder by the second. Pastor Solomon's defiant face suddenly grew expressionless. The little drama he put up was to give the uniformed men hopes that he is with them, that he is ready to defend his name anytime, anywhere. Without another word, the pastor turned abruptly behind the heavy curtains round the walls of the altar. The agents hesitated, unsure of his intentions, until one of the officers shouted, "The man is trying to escape!" The command jolted everyone into action. The squad rushed toward the stage, pushing past bewildered worshippers, but they were too late. Behind the curtains was a hidden door leading to a secret passage. Pastor Solomon had vanished. The congregation erupted in confusion and panic. Some ran toward the altar, calling his name, while others stood frozen, their faith shaken to its core. Long before the Church of Divine Abundance rose like a beacon in Lagos, Pastor Solomon was just Solomon Tayo, a small-time preacher in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of Ondo State. Back then, his sermons barely drew a dozen people, and the roof of his makeshift church leaked whenever it rained. He wore second-hand suits and lived in a single room that smelled of damp and desperation. Solomon had dreams of greatness. He believed he was destined to lead thousands, to command influence and wealth. But he lacked power, the kind of power that could draw crowds, make people empty their pockets willingly, and have them hanging on his every word. It wasn't just charisma he needed. It was something deeper, something mystical. One night, after yet another failed sermon where only a few children and few old women had shown up, Solomon decided to consult a neighbor, an Igbo man from Enugu State. "There's a man," the neighbor said in a low voice, his eyes darting around to ensure no one was listening. "A powerful dibia from my town. His name is Ezenwaka." At first, Solomon scoffed. "I'm a man of God," he said. "What would I be doing with a dibia?" His neighbor chuckled. "Man of God? Do you think those big pastors in Lagos rely on just prayer and fasting? If you want to grow, you'll need more than just the Bible." The idea gnawed at Solomon's mind for weeks. His sermons were going nowhere, and his offerings barely covered his rent. To make matters worse, his neighbor who accepted to go to Enugu on his behalf continued to collect endless sums of money from him. In desperation, Solomon made the journey to Enugu State. It turned out that his neighbor had just collected money from him and never made any move. Ezenwaka lived in a remote village near Nkanu, his shrine tucked deep within the forest. Skulls of animals hung from the rafters, and the air smelled of burning herbs and mystery. The dibia himself was a small man with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through Solomon. "You seek power," Ezenwaka said before Solomon could even speak. Solomon nodded, his palms sweaty. "Yes, Baba. I want my ministry to grow." Ezenwaka laughed, a deep, unsettling sound. "You will need more than prayers. I will give you what you need, but it comes with a price." Over the next few months, Solomon became a regular visitor to Ezenwaka's shrine. The dibia gave him charms and rituals to perform before every sermon and a talisman to wear around his neck, promising it would draw people to him like bees to honey. The results were instant. His congregation grew overnight. People swore they saw miracles in his services. Women claimed they conceived after years of barrenness. The sick reported instant healing, and his words seemed to hold an otherworldly power. Solomon transformed into Pastor Solomon, a man of God whose name began to spread beyond the small town. Pastor Solomon thrived under Ezenwaka's guidance, rebranding himself in Lagos. With his natural charisma and Ezenwaka's powers, he began targeting wealthier congregants, positioning himself as a man of prosperity who could unlock divine blessings for his followers. His sermons were no longer just fiery, they were theatrical. He introduced extravagant displays of miracles, many of them staged, using actors hired to play the sick and lame. Money poured in. Not only was he into drugs, Pastor Solomon had litany of ladies he shipped into prostitution across Europe. People whose windows of opportunity were locked tight by man-made hunger of one Nigeria flocked to Pastor Solomon. Money and influence poured in. Cathedral of Divine Abundance was built in a space of 1 year, A glittering megachurch that became the talk of the city, his congregation grew into the thousands, and his name became synonymous with wealth and success. As Pastor Solomon's fame grew in Lagos, so did the whispers of doubt. Not everyone was convinced of his miracles. Among the crowd of admirers, there were skeptics, people who saw through the theatrics and questioned the authenticity of his power. One of them was Ezekiel, a taxi driver who occasionally ferried church members to Solomon's services. Ezekiel had seen enough in Lagos to know that not everything glittered was gold. How come his miracles only happen when cameras are rolling? He often asked his passengers. How come big men doesn't fall under anointing? Others shared Ezekiel's doubts, especially within the circle of other envious pastors. Pastor Solomon dismissed his critics publicly, often mocking them during his sermons. They're jealous, he would declare, pacing the stage with his microphone in hand. They see what God is doing in this ministry and can't handle it. Let them talk while we prosper. But the criticisms didn't stop. Rumors began to circulate that Solomon's miracles were staged. A young man named Daniel, who had once worked as a church volunteer, revealed that he had been paid to pretend he was healed of paralysis. His confession spread like wildfire, fueling the suspicions. Pastor Solomon somewhat ignored the growing tension, confident that his charisma and loyal followers would drown out the noise. However, among the skeptics were influential voices. Fellow pastors, journalists, and even former congregants began to dig deeper into his practices. The pressure on Solomon was mounting. Though he still commanded large crowds, the cracks in his image were becoming visible. Each new accusation chipped away at the foundation of his empire. And as the whispers grew louder, Solomon's past, and the dark secrets he had buried, threatened to resurface. As crack in his ministry grew, so did his demands for more power. Baba, he said during one visit to Enugu, I am aware that other men of God's visit you. I want you to sever ties with them all. How dare you come to my shrine and give orders? Izinwaka's face darkened. Are you aware that I know them before you? That was how the enmity between the two began. Pastorship has become a lucrative occupation in one Nigeria, and Pastor Solomon would not accept challenge from any other Lagos men of God's. Ezinwaka would not heed to Pastor Solomon's demand, and Pastor Solomon had been avoiding his debts to the Dibia. He began to withhold what was due to the Dibia, believing himself to be untouchable. Pastor Solomon actually grew wings as to contemplate killing Ezinwaka. That was an instruction he received from another occult temple where he switched. He severally invited Ezinwaka to Lagos for that evil plan, and when the Dibia refused his invitation and promises of good life in Lagos, the pastor decided to take death down to Izinwaka in Enugu State. Their final meeting was a clash of the titans. Solomon invaded the Dibia's den with every known powerful talisman from Yoruba land. And when Ezinwaka proved that he is indeed a cuckoo, when that cannot be trapped, the pastor pulled out his 9mm semi-automatic revolver. You owe your success to me, Solomon, and you will one day look for me. That was the resounding echo that filled the air as the Dibia bolted in form of a fireball. Pastor Solomon angrily went back to Lagos to plan how to eliminate Ezinwaka. The 2 gunshots at the Dibia's shrine did not arouse attention. To kill a Dibia who has prepared charm for one will make one become almighty. That was Pastor Solomon's target. He, however, failed to understand that killing a Dibia who fortified him when his enemies are still alive is a big mistake. And it came to pass, just as Pastor Solomon was trying to extinguish the powers of rival pastors. Rival pastors were equally trying to extinguish Pastor Solomon. Kofi, a sharp and determined journalist working for a local newspaper, knew there was more to Pastor Solomon's ministry than met the eye. With rumors swirling about fake miracles, shady dealings, and now drug links, Kofi decided to go undercover. A rival pastor actually recruited Kofi for that assignment. Acrimony between pastors has gotten a dog-eat-dog. Kofi posed as a volunteer for the church's media team, claiming to be a passionate believer eager to serve. His simple charm and tech skills quickly won over the team, and within days Kofi gained access to the inner workings of the church. He observed how sermons were edited to make miracles look more dramatic, and how hired actors rehearsed their testimonies before going on stage. Kofi's most shocking discovery came during a rehearsal when he overheard a staff member bragging about how blessings were enhanced with hidden earpieces, feeding Pastor Solomon details about congregants. Kofi began recording everything. conversations, rehearsals, and financial transactions he could sneak a glance at. As Kofi delved deeper, he uncovered evidence that made his contractor double his pay. He found payments made to individuals who had posed as healed congregants and receipts for extravagant personal expenses disguised as ministry costs. One night, Kofi discovered an even darker secret, a ledger of donations that showed huge sums being funneled into offshore accounts. Kofi also documented private meetings where Pastor Solomon's staff planned how to deal with skeptics. Once Kofi had gathered enough evidence for his contractor, the rival pastor was set to blow the lid off Pastor Solomon's operation. With evidence intact, the pastor tipped off the security agents, sharing details of the church's activities and its connection to drug trafficking. The agents stormed the private residence of the general overseer of Church of Divine Abundance. But Pastor Solomon was one step ahead. Just as they entered house, another group of uniformed men stormed. They were from Abuja, with orders to take over the case. That was how the first attempt to nail Pastor Solomon failed inside Lagoon. Order from above has generally been accepted as part of God's commandment in one Nigeria, and whenever such order come from above, anyone who values his or her life will simply stay clear. Kofi, being an insider watched as material evidence he took risks to collect, was shredded. Frustrated overwhelmed him when he discovered that some senior security officials in Lagos were protecting Pastor Solomon. Bribes and influence had turned many officers into loyal defenders of his empire. Any attempts to investigate him were either delayed or shut down entirely. The 13th commandment of the criminal syndicate of One Nigeria dictates that he who has gotten enough wealth has gotten enough talisman. Pastor Solomon has gotten the wealth and increasingly confident that he has gotten enough talisman. Realizing that regular law enforcement might not be enough, the pastor who contracted Kofi devised a new plan. Solomon's life as an underworld kingpin had been exposed, but bringing him to justice would require more than just Lagos police officers. It would require breaking the system that had allowed him to thrive. Kofi also alerted trusted members of the press, ensuring that if Solomon managed to escape again, the media would expose the corruption shielding him. The beginning of the end for Pastor Solomon's empire started with the apprehension of his trusted aide, Deal. It was supposed to be a routine smuggling operation. Deal had flown into Lagos from Brazil, carrying carefully concealed packages in his luggage. He walked confidently through Murtala Muhammad International Airport, thinking his charm and connections would see him through customs as usual. But luck was not on his side. A random check by an alert customs officer led to the discovery of 12 kilograms of cocaine hidden in his suitcases. Delhi's confidence crumbled as drug agents surrounded him. Sweating and trembling, he tried to claim innocence, but the agents weren't buying it. Under pressure, Del blurted out the name of his employer. "It's for Pastor Solomon. It's for the ministry." The news traveled quickly to the drug headquarters and to the rival pastor who was willing to spend his last note to get Solomon behind bars. Del's confession was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. They wasted no time organizing a raid on the Cathedral of Divine Abundance. Del, pale and disheveled, was dragged into the church in handcuffs as gasps and murmurs rippled through the congregation. The sight of the pastor's trusted aide in such a state shook many worshippers to their core. Dele looked up at Pastor Solomon, his voice trembling as he cried out, "I'm sorry, sir. They made me tell them everything." For the first time, fear flickered in Pastor Solomon's eyes. But it lasted only a moment. He sharply rebuked the confessions of Del before diving behind the heavy curtains at the back of the altar. His secret escape route was a tunnel network he had commissioned during the construction of the cathedral. He feared a day like this might come. As Solomon ran through the dimly lit tunnel, his breath came in ragged gasps. The air was thick, and his footsteps echoed in the confined space. His mind raced with panic and anger. But above all, he couldn't escape the haunting words of Ezenwaka, the Dibia who had once been his ally. "You owe your success to me, Solomon, and you will one day look for me." The words played over and over in his head like a curse. Sweat poured down his face as he stumbled through the narrow passage, cursing himself for abandoning the man who had given him his start. He emerged from the tunnel in an abandoned warehouse a few blocks away, where a waiting car whisked him away to safety. That night, he sat alone in a dimly lit safe house, the weight of his crumbling world pressing down on him. His empire was falling apart. His loyal aide had betrayed him, and the arms of the law, which he had no control, was closing in. With no one else to turn to, Pastor Solomon made a desperate decision. He would go to Enugu and beg Ezenwaka for help. It had been years since their fallout, but Solomon believed that the powerful Dibia was his only chance of salvaging what remained of his life. Under the cover of darkness, Solomon left Lagos, dressed in plain clothes to avoid detection. He traveled by road, taking back routes and switching vehicles to avoid being traced. As the city lights of Lagos fade into the distance, Solomon felt a strange mix of dread and hope. He hated the idea of crawling back to Ezenwaka, but what choice did he have? Pastor Solomon arrived in Enugu under the cover of night, his nerves frayed and his spirit crushed. He had nothing left, no followers, no allies, no money. The car he hired dropped him at the edge of the forest that led to Ezenwaka's shrine. The dark trees loomed over him as he trudged the familiar path, clutching his bag tightly, his heart pounding with desperation. The moment he emerged from the forest clearing, he knew something was wrong. The shrine was dark and silent. Gone were the flickering flames and the rhythmic chants that once filled the air. Instead, the place looked abandoned, its sacred objects scattered and decayed. Skulls dangled loosely from their ropes, and the once bright charms were dull and lifeless. "Baba Ezenwaka!" Solomon called out, his voice trembling. Only the distant chirping of crickets replied. He pushed open the heavy wooden door of the shrine and stepped inside. The air was thick with the musty smell of neglect. A young man sitting on a low stool at the corner of the room startled at his arrival. He looked up, his face weary and expressionless. "What are you doing here?" the young man asked, his voice flat. "I've come to see Baba," Solomon said quickly, his voice a mix of urgency and fear. "I need his help. Tell him Solomon is here." The young man gave him a long, pitying look. "Baba Ezenwaka joined his ancestors 6 months ago. He's gone." Solomon staggered backward as though struck. "Gone?" he whispered, his hands trembling. "No, that can't be. He can't be gone." "His time came," the young man replied. "But if you've come to settle debts, I suggest you leave. Those who owe him now deal with the spirits he served." Solomon sank to his knees, his chest heaving. Ezenwaka was gone, the one man who could have helped him rebuild his crumbling life. The words of the young man echoed ominously. Those who owe him now deal with the spirits he served. Suddenly, memories of his broken promises to Ezenwaka flooded his mind. The unpaid debts, the sacrifices avoided, the warnings ignored. He had taken the power of the Dibia and used it for his own gain, never thinking the consequences would catch up with him. Now with Ezenwaka gone, Solomon felt the weight of those consequences pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. He stumbled out of the shrine, his mind racing. There was no one left to turn to, no escape from the fallout of his choices. As he wandered aimlessly through the dark forest, the sound of distant drums seemed to grow louder in his ears. Whether it was his guilt or the spirits Ezenwaka had warned him about, Solomon couldn't tell. All he knew was that the power he had once wielded had turned on him, leaving him utterly alone. Solomon's story ended far from the pulpit he once commanded. Stripped of his wealth and power, he disappeared into obscurity, a man running from himself. Some said he fled to a neighboring country, others believed he wandered into the wilderness and never returned. Yet others claim he joined the Fulani cattle rearers, roaming the forests of Igbo land. No one truly cared anymore. His name became a footnote, a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. As Pastor Solomon disappeared into the wilderness of obscurity, his name began to fade from the minds of the masses. Yet the legacy of his deeds and the system that created him lingered like a stubborn wound on the soul of society. The Cathedral of Divine Abundance stood empty, its once polished floors now gathering dust. The crowds that had once flocked to its marble halls now wandered elsewhere, searching for new men of God to provide the miracles they craved. Solomon had fallen, but the cycle continued, unbroken. For many in the streets of Lagos and beyond, religion remained the only balm for their unrelenting struggles. Poverty was widespread, the government corrupt, and opportunities scarce. People turned to religion not out of deep faith, but out of desperation, a last refuge when nothing else could save them. Amina, the widow who had once sold her land for Pastor Solomon's promises, summed it up best in an interview with Kofi, the journalist who had exposed Solomon's empire. "When you have nothing," she said, "you cling to anything that gives you hope, even if it's an illusion." Her words echoed Karl Marx's famous sentiment, "Religion is the opium of the people." In Nigeria's chaotic streets, indeed across the spirit continent, this opium is thriving, numbing the pain of systemic failure while feeding the ambitions of charlatans. New pastors rose to fill the void which Pastor Solomon left behind, each more flamboyant than the last, promising blessings in exchange for obedience and offerings. Their faces changed, but the formula remained the same. The masses, weighed down by poverty and hopelessness, continued to seek refuge in religion, their spirits trapped by the opium of empty promises. Religion as a beautiful bride has found politics as a perfect husband. Their long hours in bed meant that there is no political will to arrest the ugly situation. And so, the cycle continued, fed by the same afflictions that created them. And for the countless common civilians seeking hope in a hopeless situation, the line between faith and deception grew ever thinner. People abundantly consumed the hard drug, and as they do, their afflictions multiplied.